Gonna hit record and we're on. And yeah, so today we're chatting about group agents, what they are, why they're relevant for you, and how we're thinking about building it. And so in today's session, we will possibly, you could probably start off by sharing a little bit of background into it. I think for most people here, there's still this question of why they're even relevant, like why are we even having this conversation? So maybe starting from there could be a good point. Um, and then moving on to yeah what we can actually do with group agents, and then probably move into like how you've been thinking about it and how we could go about designing this.
Sure. Maybe even hearing from Lynn or Bob some of their experience with group agents would be worthwhile while they're on the call, because I'll send through, there's a forum, a thread on the Holochain forum that's just called How Will Holochain Handle Group Agents, and Lynn started that one, and it's kind of been one of the most long-running discussions in Holochain history, I think, in how group agents are going to work in a environment that is built to work on single agent agency above all else. What do you think? Do you two want to have a brief intro about group agents, or shall I keep going in a more technical leaning?
If you like, but I don't know if it's necessary or not. I mean, I think if you just think about kind of how things work in the real world economically, there are groups, like any kind of organization has agency as much as a person does. And, like let's see, if you're a biodigester operation and you want to set up an exchange with POSPI, and that's done by the biodigester organization. If whoever did set up that exchange from there left the organization, that exchange is that say it's an order is still valid. It's the organization that has the agency, not the person in that case. So, and even just as a side note, in Holochain, it's not really the person who is the agent, it's the user. So if you have two devices, that's two Holochain agents and one person agent. So yeah, I don't know if that helped.
Yeah, thanks. And that's a good distinction to bring into it as well, I think, because a lot of this is around those kind of quite core ideological distinctions. I suppose the biggest one that we probably all take here is against legal personhood for corporations, but that's not a view that everybody takes. And that's part of it, I suppose, like, because you can only have an agent with a key pair as a point of authority that accesses a holochain network, which, as you say, means one device. Generally, it means that it's one device that one agent owns, but it might be a shared device as well. But yeah, nevertheless, it's always a singular device. So then how do you have a group that's actually a gestalt of multiple agents that needs to make decisions collectively? And how do you represent that system which doesn't allow you to do that? I mean, I suppose there's some very easy answers to that question when you're talking about legacy systems and making Holochain integrate with other stuff. Because I think in a traditional context, usually it is just one device acts as the business in these kinds of situations, right? Like there'll be a mainframe in the basement or something in the cloud environment, or probably be a manager that just signs on behalf of the company usually, wouldn't it? You look deep in thought there, Sid.
Yeah, there's just like I don't know if I should bring that in now, but a couple of thoughts. One, I think most of us haven't even thought about the importance of of representing a group. I guess most people just figure if it's an entity or a collective that's operating a node, they would just figure out governance at their end. And so it seems what you're talking about is bringing in some element of that governance onto Holochain. And
Yeah,
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 and so I think it allows for organization without necessarily incorporating as a legal entity. So it could just be a group of friends that have an informal understanding among themselves, which now gets formalized, or a group, or associates or alliances that can now work together. And the second,
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely, absolutely.
mm,
First place we ran into this was in Sensorca, which is not an official uh, legal organization at all, but they
mm,
have agency as an organization.
mm,
They make agreements as an organization. They have governance as an organization. When they need
mm,
a legal organization, they set up a front group that has that is a legal entity, but by preference, since the network does not want to have a legal organization, but they still have agency.
mm, yeah. And I think there's also, you could argue like 50% of the world's population still doesn't have access to setting up their own legal organization, so that this gives them the tool to organize themselves at that level as well. Yeah, this one point you made, maybe you could clarify. You said you the legal system makes a distinction between corporations and people, and you don't. Yeah.
no, no, not that, but quite strongly the opposite. That
Oh.
I'd make it between organizations and people as totally different kinds of entities.
Hmm.
Um, and like when we start having multinational courts that corporations can go to sue governments and be given
Hmm.
legal personhood, that becomes weird.
Okay.
But then there's a whole other line of giving legal personhood to natural systems, right? Like there's all
Hmm.
other kinds of collective entities that you
Hmm.
might govern, and that's a whole different ball game that's quite
Hmm.
ethically complicated in its own right, I think.
Hmm.
Um, yeah. So yeah, it's just kind of interesting reflecting on why you might want to govern an organization through Holochain to begin with, I suppose. And thank you for kind of calling it out as being about on-chain governance, to use blockchain parlance. That is what we're talking about, really. So it's sort of the question of how much do you want to automate, and what is it beneficial to automate versus what are you actually just oppressing yourself in automating. And that's not so easy of a question when I look at things like the original DAO on Ethereum. It was always an empowering act, and I was one of the people that put money into it in the process. Like, it seemed like an empowering thing to do, to have a corporation that was entirely beholden to the will of the collective and could not operate except for the way that its members governed it in. But then if you look at it a bit more closely, what you've done from another perspective is you've taken the ability to make the decision and taken it away from the people and given it to this disembodied deterministic machine. So it's sort of not as clear cut for me as to whether it's empowering to have things on chain or not. Yeah, I mean, and so I think in a lot of traditional places, you would have some human governance that controls who has access to the server room and can, log on and make changes. And in a holochain-esque context, you might just have a different set of social processes that mean tinkering through a holochain network to set it up, that then mean who can and can't make decisions on behalf of the group, and in which contexts, I suppose. So those are the two things that kind of come in almost by necessity with group agents. Is like, one, what are the roles that individuals have within the group, and then two, what capabilities do those roles give them. And that's kind of just worth touching base on a little bit before we get into the more complicated group stuff, I suppose. And if I just drop in the chat, there's a module on GitHub by the ICE team. It's just called Holochain Roles. and it's just a pretty simple module that lets you define a bunch of roles for agents within a network, basically. It's actually not very far from the value flows agent model, which I might as well share screen. And oh, I need you to enable share screen sharing. Sorry.
Never learn. There you go.
Yeah, so this holochain roles project, hopefully that's big enough. I think it would be this one. So, there's a role, the agent address, and who assigned it, but it's kind of more or less what you'd expect in terms of, just being able to say this person is a member of this group, and member being the role type anyway. Comparing that to the agent schema, the ways that we in value flows relate agents to each other, we do them through these agent relationships. So it's more or less the same thing. It just gives you a little bit of extra fidelity in order to be able to say whether there's a reciprocal role and what it means. So you might have, a user is a member of an organization, but the organization has a member of that user, kind of thing. More or less the same thing anyway. It's just assigning some roles to people. And then off the back of those roles, you get down into actual capabilities in terms of holochains internals and what the roles, what assignment of those roles by another user unlocks for you in terms of capabilities, if that makes sense. I kind of want to maybe compartmentalize this whole roles conversation because the rest of this stuff is complicated enough without it. So maybe we can just take a moment and finish up on everything to do with roles before we go into the more module overarching to do with groups.
Yeah, it makes sense.
So possibly, do you mind clarifying your concern with the DAO of Ethereum as a what its limitations are and how you're trying to design to solve those problems?
Oh, look, I wouldn't go that far. That's what I'm trying to do. Just they're different things working in different ways, I suppose, more than anything. And it's not necessarily a problem so much as it is an ideological perspective, I think. Like for me, the idea of having a DAO that you take all the human actions and turn them into a machine action that requires all the humans to agree to some threshold in order to move. It just means that you're making a bargain that the algorithm keeps serving you, and you can't change it. So for me, it's an oppressive act to give up that power. Whereas if you just held it in the group and had a constitution that said that 80% of people have to vote, then you can do that, and you can also vote to change the constitution by some provision. One hopes. So yeah, it's just about the tension between putting things in a computer and then them becoming completely inflexible and kind of trapping yourself in the move to try and make things more efficient, which I think is always a danger when you start doing governance inside the machine to some degree.
So you're proposing that governance is an ongoing process, and that functionality is offered through the organizational code construction.
Yeah. And if it's not awkward, it's probably at least something that only the coders have much of a say in your organization, I suppose is the other thing. Or at least, have any insight into the possibilities of how it can evolve.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, that's a kind of worthwhile frame to take further forward a bit, I think, because some of this we're still kind of waiting for a bit of stability around the way that agent validation works to be sure that this is possible to work in the way we want. And I'll probably leave like the really technical parts right to the end, but I was chatting with Guillaume about it earlier in the week, and it seems that there might be a way in which trying to go down this path of modularity means that you end up needing to have a weaker security model than you would with a simpler holochain app, in some kind of significant ways. But they're quite interesting, and there's some more reflections on contract programming and blockchains with that as well, actually. But yeah, let's move on from roles for a second maybe and talk about this comment, which I'll chuck in the chat again. Actually, how do I even get, there it is. Yeah, so this is sort of a spec that I put up a couple of weeks ago as a start to think about how a group might work and what functionality you would want for it. And I'm taking this very much from the perspective of using the networks themselves as the auth structures rather than building auth structures into networks. That's sort of a difference to what I'm seeing being done by some other projects, where it's kind of like, we talked a lot about this hypothetical Reddit clone in the architecture course a while back. So say you build a Reddit and you have this whole one DNA that holds all of the posts and controls who can get in there and post. So then you might set up something in the validation rules that says, okay, you can't post until you've registered a profile, or you can't post until someone's approved you, whatever it is. But in that architecture, what you essentially have then is there's this big network that everybody, even the unapproved people, have access to and will be holding pieces of. So there's, potentially some issues with privacy in terms of the data visibility in the way that that's done. Like they won't see all of it, but they'll see their shard of the network that they're holding on their disk. And the other thing about it is that I think it means that you end up with a fairly diverse and complex set of different auth structures in different networks, because everyone's going to have their different idea about, okay, for Reddit, it means you have to register a profile. So it'll be talking to this specific API that registers a profile for Reddit. And that doesn't really have anything generically to do with access or groups. It's not really easily reusable behavior. So I think it means that we see a lot of different holochain apps that are quite separate, that don't really talk to each other very well in that model. And I'm not quite sure how you would go about combating that technically in that architecture, other than, maybe just similar patterns of authentication and registration across all networks that you want to be compatible, but even then you're going to have to do weird stuff to join one network and bring your credentials from the other one potentially, or, just replicate the login and have a bunch of different agents in different places that you need to be approved with separately. Hard to say. So part of the reason to go down this runtime modularity path is to combat that. And how do we arrive at systems where you can more easily change the groups that you're a member of without having to go and be reapproved in places? And how can groups evolve over time? But also more particularly, how do groups join other groups? And that's something in the kind of separate registration space for every different network that would become quite difficult, I imagine, because then everybody has to have a different clone of the same representation of groups in different networks, and they have to be able to copy that data in and crawl through to ask, is the person in the subgroup, and all kinds of stuff. And you have to do all that here too. And it's maybe a little more complicated to wrap your head around initially, but I think there's much fewer moving parts and a much simpler code architecture going forward. And maybe the best way to show some of that is to run through some tests that I've written just to kind of explore the idea. They don't pass yet.
Could you, before we jump in, I really love the way you articulated using networks as authorizing structures. Um, like, could we break that down a little more? So does, by virtue of being part of a network, I have access to a certain set of things or certain set of other networks, right? And is that a good way to frame it?
Yeah, it is. That's one of this. I
And
think losing
and
count, we
so
must have talked about 3 different pieces already, but this is another one of those sort of essential components that needs to be present in order for this to be functional. And that is, you need some generic
yeah,
zone plug into a DNA that just delegates to a different DNA and says you have access if you're already in this group, basically.
yeah. So that's what I was getting to. Like, how do we do that? Is that is that through tokens, or is it through this kind of delegation? Yeah.
Yeah, I know I have it around here somewhere. Yeah, I think it might just been offhand mentioned in this thread. But to answer that question, you need to first answer the question of what does a group agent network look like and how does it behave? Because you need whatever's checking the capability to know how to ask the group whether it has the capability. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yep.
Um,
I figured
so
like they might just enter the DNA hash or something, specify the DNA hash, but yeah,
yeah,
that might.
that's the way I'm thinking of looking at it. I'm wondering if people on the call may be able to help with some of the edge parts of this code as well, because there are things that I haven't explored yet that kind of touch on down at the internals of Holochain. But yeah, I mean, this would sort of show how I'd see it working. So I've got these 2 different DNAs being spawned here. They're both instances of the agent DNA, but they're separate instances. And so I've got one here that represents a project that someone's running, that they've already got operational with people inside it. And another is this shared group that somebody else is a steward of, and they want to join that group and have their project join it. So that's the scenario I'm mocking out here. You comfortable with that? Make sense?
Yep.
So that's not actually the name of this test. It starts fairly simply. So I'm creating this person, Brianna, connecting them to the shared group only and saying that's their agent DNA. So that's all that code does, really. Pulls out their address so I know what their public key identity is within that network. And then I've got Alice here is the person who's coming in who has her own project group, but also has access to this shared collective group that Brianna is the host of. And I know there are ways to do it. I just haven't investigated the advanced config yet, but I should be able to have Alice share the same agent ID between both these networks. But I'm writing it so that she doesn't, because I feel like kind of you shouldn't have to by default.
Yeah.
Probably having it within each network is what you want.
Yeah.
There's some
So
sort of
on the hollow port, when we use hollow ports, we don't show up with the same agent ID across DNAs,
yeah,
but
that
they're
makes sense.
resolving it or providing solutions for it through deep key, which would
Yeah.
basically, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think the way it works is sort of like a key. What do they call it? There's a technical word for it. Anyway, it's where you derive a key from a parent. So you sort of have one key that then you can say, well, if I lose it, I can use this other key to wipe it off the network and change it. And all these other devices can have access, so on. Yeah. So anyway, this could be someone's hollow port and someone's laptop. These could be totally separate identities. It doesn't much matter. And I think it's worth running the test to make sure it works like that. Anyway, so then I've got this other person, Carolyn, who is only a member of the project group that Alice is managing. So I just kind of wanted someone to test who was in the group that was going to join, but is not actually privy to any of the joining stuff going on. And I think that will work out, but we'll find out. And probably what I also need for this test, which I don't yet have, is essentially another agent that is a member of all networks, just to be able to observe the overall state of things, because I'm not sure that I have enough to be able to see everything I need to see in this. But anyway.
For a basin, our county, King County, would be a really important, like that, having that ability to see what's going on would be key.
Yeah, the pattern of having kind of a separate network, actually this cross-border trade is like that. A separate network where these are all kind of like marketplace layer things, planning and proposal, just to be able to put out intents and group them to specify trades that people want to execute. But yeah, having that as a separate marketplace network, and then so not down here. So this is the customer themselves and the network that they're making the orders on, but then also having this one. Here we go. Having the courier have access to that marketplace so they can reach into the market and fill orders that they see coming through. That was the case in this simple example. I'm presuming, obviously, it'd be a much more complex supply chain in a real situation. But yeah, anyway, separate marketplace is a good pattern, and yeah, where the rubber really starts to hit the road in terms of engaging on the ground stakeholders, I suppose, because, you know, deploying a county-wide network to share resources or open a marketplace for bio-waste or transport or whatever it is kind of becomes a much bigger conversation, doesn't it? Anyway, so we have just these people being initialized and the networks they're in, and that's all pretty straightforward. And then I'm just running a few queries here to check some things out. So the agent registration zone is one that's already on the Holochain Open Dev org. Yeah, Holochain Open Dev agent registration. And so if you refer to the GitHub issue I sent in the chat, this one in issue 9, the agent registration stuff is kind of fundamental to the group stuff when you think about the low-level modular building blocks that are necessary to do that. So the first thing you need in a group is who is the singular agents that are a member of the group. So I've got there's a get registered agents callback already that I can use to query who's in the group to start with, and that all works mostly. I did need to revisit some of it. And then beyond the agent stuff, there's a couple other bits of functionality you need. One, so I'd add a group agent zone, was one of the things in that spec, and a get group ID function that really just returns the hash of the DNA that I'm calling it from. So this is the same as the network ID, really. And that gives me a unique identifier that I can use to identify this project group network in the other network. And I don't know what the code inside the DNA looks like to do that yet, but I'm told that you can actually just pull it out of the local source chain, because the first entry in your local source chain is always the DNA itself, and the second one is always your agent doing the DNA. Yeah, don't know if anyone on the call knows how to access that. I know I've seen it in some of the HAP code that the core team makes. I just haven't done it myself. So yeah, that's the first bit in that, and there's a check here just to make sure that the two different agents see the same project group ID, which is something I'd be asserting in a test. And then the next ones you're looking at, it gets into the capabilities and role stuff, because the next thing you want to do is set up some facility to allow a group to join another group. And because you're talking about an environment where everybody has individual agency, it means that the agent who is adding the group, it means that some agent is going to have to add the group to another group. And so then you're going to want some permission system that asks whether that agent is allowed to add that group to another group. So I figured there's some ways with the social triangulation zones that Guillaume has built to build in some very simple capability management that allows you just to have a group you can add to other groups and nothing else on top of that. And the way I'm doing that, as per the GitHub issue, is essentially when I'm asking if this group, if this agent Alice has the group capability for register group for this project group network. Yeah, I know that maybe didn't flow as well as I wanted, but I just kind of wanted to line up the variables with the words. And in the kind of simple implementation, you basically say then that anybody who is a member of the group automatically has the capability to register that group. So that's a pretty easy one to do through the social triangulation, because you just have to ask if the agent's registered. So a few checks there. And then I'm just diving into GraphQL because I'd implement this with a GraphQL wrapper in HoloREA. When I write the test for this as a standalone module, I won't do the GraphQL version. But these are basically calling a couple of these methods underneath. But basically they are calling get registered agents within the agent registration zone, and get registered group agents within the group agent host zone. And those two things together, would give me the two resolvers I need to implement people and organizations to give me a list of all the people and all the organizations within this collaboration space. So in the initial state, I should see that, okay, there's one person in there, it's Brianna, and no organizations. And then using the social triangulation stuff that Guillem's written, I can start to do all the steps, which I'm calling here directly rather than running through GraphQL, because they're not part of the value flow spec. It's non-standard behavior for joining networks and things. But you could wire some extra GraphQL endpoints up to call them through GraphQL. I could run through that as an example, actually, if we want. But anyway, essentially the flow is that Brianna first has to call into social triangulation and vouch for Alice so that Alice can then join into the shared group. So now Alice can actually call into it. She'll be allowed through the agent validation. And so in the collective group, she asks the group social triangulation zone to vouch for the group that she wants to add. And then because of these default rules, where we're basically saying everybody has to vote, Brianna also has to run the same vouch for Alice's group so that it can join. And then once all that's done, there's this manual API endpoint to call to register the group itself that just registers the group ID. And that's it. And if all of those constraints are met, then you've got a way not only to do this, but I should be able to do this as well, because I'm pretty sure these are endpoints in value flows, but if not, there should be anyway. So yeah, and you know, just the nature of having very, very simple recursive modules means that I've got these organizations, in this case being the collective group network. So when I'm getting out this list of organizations, I would get an array of one, and this collective group's ID would be the first ID I'd get. And then it would go and be querying that DNA to find out from group agent host who the registered group agents are, and now the registered agents from the agent registration, and pull them out. So yeah.
You scroll up, like that little maneuver you did there with Brianna vouching and then Alice. Yeah. So Brianna first vouches for Alice. Alice vouches for the subgroup to run shared group. Okay. Okay. Got it.
And so these are just, you know, some kind of the simplest possible configuration, I think, that we can figure out, because, you know, just vouching for people to join a network and having rules that say if you're in the network you have access to do stuff is as simple as it gets. But as you can see very quickly, you know, this does not work for everybody. So very quickly it turns into a conversation as to how do you actually govern the entry of people into each of those groups, and what governance processes.
That's where I was gonna go.
how much of it do you want to put on chain versus off chain and all that stuff? You know, like maybe you have all your governance off chain and you just trust someone completely to have an admin role that means they get to all the rules, or maybe a few people do that. I mean, that's the way that the groups we run at the moment are set up, right? So just have admins of these tools.
So this is super interesting to me because I feel like that's like something I've been thinking about, and I feel like that's where the designs or the conversations around the reputation vault could fit in, because as opposed to like you said, a person stepping up and going out and vouching, you actually have like a set of data, like let's say Lynn has fulfilled these criteria, and so that gives her access to the DNA just by virtue of exposing that data through the reputation vault. Um, and that could be like a pattern that plugs into what you're talking about. No, that makes sense.
Yep. And it feels like it's becoming even more fundamental than that. I don't know if I'll convey this quite well. I only was speaking about it yesterday, but Guillaume is going to refactor the social triangulation zone quite heavily sometime soon. It'll become quite like the group agent zone in that it necessitates a pattern where there's kind of like a provider and a consumer kind of relationship between two zones that talk to each other. So, with the group agent, there's the group agent itself, but there also needs to be the zone that handles the registration of group agents in the one that the group is registered with. They pair together. And it becomes very difficult with vouchers because one, you need to be a member of the network to begin with in order to even query whether there are vouchers. And then two, how reliable is any kind of network state or subset of network partition that says you have the vouchers and you can join the network anyway. And especially when you think about it in a multi-network context and that you might be wanting to bring vouchers from other networks to let you in. So, then you're kind of always having to check back to the network to ask if there are vouchers. And these things all become quite difficult to validate because you never know, as someone who's already a part of the network and a valid member of it. So say there's this business that's running and there's a dozen of us all running the network together. When someone new's coming to join, me as an individual member, I never actually know whether I'm seeing the most up-to-date information about their ability to join. So I'm almost kind of, when they say they've got these vouchers, I'm almost having to just trust some little view of the network that they have vouchers that might be not necessarily true in the last moment. So he's refactoring it essentially so that you actually would bring vouchers as signed, attested transactions with you as you join the network. So you're bringing in the vouchers from some external network versus trying to be approved within the network. And the reason to do that is that when you're bringing the data in that way, it allows you to have everything and all the signatures you need to validate it within the payload. So it's kind of like almost, it's not bringing your full source chain, but it's bringing parts of everybody else's source chains that say they vouched for you. And then you kind of have to go and check all the vouchers from there, but at least you know which vouchers you need to check to start with.
Like which agent addresses you need to go query.
Yeah. Which sounds very much like a reputation port to me, like.
Yeah, it is. And like my issue with the vouchers thing is it's so almost paternalistic, right? Like it's so, like it's like a block, like you have to use vouchers for everything. And obviously that aspect of like human intervention. So you need to trust possibly to have read the data, to read the factors right and taken that call. And it works well with those kinds of circles. But I think there's this broad spectrum of activity that should be enabled just on the basis of reputational data that I might have in hundreds of other DNAs and contexts. and I think that is really critical to those network effects for social trust related scaling. Um, so yeah, I mean, maybe that's another conversation, but I feel like the reputation vault serves as the switchboard, like opening up the ports to other DNAs that you can read that data off. Um, and so yeah, I feel like that plugs in really well with where group agents is going.
Mhm.
Yeah, I am,
I'm just
and
looking
maybe
at my
yeah,
note.
that's another
Sorry.
conversation anyway.
Sure. So the other thing I haven't looped back around on is the security things I wanted to talk about. And it's been really good actually, because it's really landed an understanding for me in terms of where code is executed in Holochain, as in which nodes it actually gets run on. And the distinction is basically that when you make a Zome API call, the logic that gets run there is only being run on your local machine. So when I say log an economic event, it's only my computer that's actually running the logic to log the economic event. Then what happens is somewhere in that it writes a bunch of links and entries to the DHT. And as soon as it does that, then that gets replicated out to other nodes on the network. And then it's the validation rules for those entry types that get run by everybody on the network to ensure that the data is meant to be there. And we've talked a bit about the difficulties involved in calling across DNAs during validation. And essentially, it's sort of become clear that at this case, until some of the dependency framework that Holochain Core are talking about starts to crystallize, we can't really do a cross DNA check in a validation callback. So I can't have a validation callback for something that gets added to the network that says, oh, this entry is valid if you go and check this other network and see if I'm a member of the group. Because it relies on every node having that same network set up and bridge to say that you're a member of the group. And if they don't, it will become invalid and you'll get consistency across the but you can put your validation into the Zome API calls outside of the validation logic. And then you're talking about basically writing procedural code that if it doesn't check out at the start of the function, you just throw an error then and or return false and skip the logic basically. And that's quite interesting because that is where I realized that if we take this approach, we by necessity to some degree at this point are moving Holochain zones closer to Ethereum smart contracts, in that what really makes the framework powerful for Holochain is if you fully embrace this idea of a validation heavy logic light application and try and put most of your application logic as actually validation logic. And I even remember in the early days, some of the tooling, when you were writing Solidity smart contracts, you could put these little bits of metadata in the comment block to use as pre and post conditions. And then your framework would run tests and make sure that those things were never false before or after the contract was executed. And that's basically what the validation mechanism is in Holochain. You know, you're writing a bunch of pre and post conditions that say that this is the state the DHT has to be in before and after the data has been written. And if it doesn't validate, then you don't write the data. So you create these kind of more declarative, low-level, explicit guarantees about your code. Whereas when you take the procedural approach, which is what we all ended up doing in Ethereum, and you know, those pre and post conditions never really ended up getting any widespread support. So people just tried to write contracts and be really smart about it and hope that no one could get behind it and manipulate the data erroneously. And then back to the DAO, that's what happened with what was an uppercase E and a lowercase e was the difference between $150 million and nothing. So yeah, we're kind of heading down a similar path here, because if we want to create things where you can plug groups in like that, then actually in the Zome API layer, before you write data to the DHT is where we need to do all the checks, because you need to start by saying, is the person who's running this a member of this group and has access, and check the local DNA. Because you think about, like you have an organization and you want to create a sub project that you have some external contractors who are also part of the work there. So it means that those external contractors will not have the DNA connected that's your organization's DNA. So they won't be able to know anything about who is a member of your organization, which means that when they want to perform actions, all the checks that they need to go through have to be local to this sub project, because they don't have the organization awareness. So then in your Zome API call, you're saying, okay, do I have this role within this DNA? Yes, I do. Okay, then keep going and write the record. Whereas if I'm from the original business, the logic saying, am I a member in this local project DNA? No, I'm not. Am I a member? Is there, the business's collective DNA bridged? Yes, it is. Am I a member in that? Yes, I am. Okay, then I can proceed. But you have to do all that in your logic. You can't do it in validation. So it means that if you have any bugs in your code and anyone's able to get through and write stuff to the DNA, then people will just trust it, and you will never know that it was written by someone who wasn't supposed to have access to write it.
Yeah.
So,
That's your trade-off in security.
That's the trade-off, yeah. And it's going to be, I think the most interesting question for me is how tightly can I confine that? Like if that's confined to a single zone that deals with those records, and that only manages groups, then that's kind of a thing I'm willing to accept, because it means that we just have to be very, very robust about the code for one module. But if it means that when you put in like the group agent host into your app, then your app has to be super secure as well, then it becomes a bigger ask.
I'm
I'm
just
just not
thinking,
sure.
wondering if there's a better way to address it. And yeah, that's probably worth throwing open to the community, or maybe you have already.
Yeah, a little bit. I think it's worth throwing open to core as well, because if we have a deterministic dependency validation framework, and the conversation has so far sort of been, being able to say that this entry I'm writing depends on this other entry within the local DNA, within the foreign DNA, we're not sure. And then basically the node will just hold that entry and keep checking, but not validate it until it has all the other pieces validated. That seems like something we might need at some point to provide more transactional guarantees than we have at the moment. But I've also found that there's only really one or two places in value flows amongst all the complexity where I need that kind of guarantee. There's a couple of weird constraints, like, you can only add a event to this process if there's open commitments that were still not completed, but like there's just a lot of graph traversals to make in that kind of a logic, and some of them cross DNAs. So those will be interesting when we get to them.
Oh, that's interesting. How are we doing on time?
Come up to the hour, and yeah, I know that was all kind of a bit of a dense headful this week. But these are the things that are unraveling in groups. I'm curious from others on the call whether that insider information was useful or kind of overwhelming at this point, if there's any specific parts you'd like to unpack more. But also just, anything you can say from your own use cases as insight as to where groups might be useful, or how you're thinking of using them yourselves.
This is Kamal. I mean, definitely from the county level, if the county is going to be watching what's happening here in our ecosystem, there's going to definitely need that capability. The biodigester plant has multiple people who run it, so that could also be a use case for that. And then we have a farm that has multiple farmers. One farm is a couple, so they would probably just use one. But the other farm is a larger farm, and they have multiple workers. So that could be a use case there. But yeah, I mean, some of the other stuff is over my head, but other than that, I feel like, yeah, it's good learning.
I'll chuck in the chat as well. There's Holloway issue 83, which is kind of the core part of this. It's the countersigning for group agents. It becomes a technical feature that's necessary. And like that is what you need to build all the role stuff for, because basically you need to say, you know, of the people, so, you know, I'll speak from our own perspective. Like, we'd want to have a group agent for the Hollow REA project, so that when we're working on the project, we can log hours and say that, you know, we're making a transaction and sending some of our time from ourselves to the project. And then, you know, what are the rules around who signs for that? Like, does it just have to be anyone from the collective, or should it be anyone except for the person who originally put it forward? Should there be particular people that approve hours, that kind of stuff? So yeah, it sort of feels like this is all the necessary plumbing needed to be able to answer that question of having the group say, yes, you know, you did your time.
Thanks. This was great, and I'm wondering what, like, as we get more insights from core, especially around capability tokens and the added functionalities there, like how that might change the designs a bit. Like, I think, especially from what I hear, Hollow RSM has gotten a lot better with tokens, right? Like capability tokens, or things are a lot easier, is what I'm hearing. I don't know.
To be honest, I never fully understood the original implementation, so I can't comment too much. Yeah, like, I think this is as deep as I really want to get into group agents at the moment, until 2020 HDK is available and I can start to see what it looks like. Because there's just still a lot of potential unknowns and moving pieces underneath the bits needed to implement this. So I think it's really good to talk about and design as a community what the high level API and the strategy for making it work should be. But yeah, the actual implementation, I think for me, it's not something I want to spend time on until I know I'm not going to have to re-architect it too much.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I had a word with Bear, and maybe having like an informal session with Holochain Core on some of these aspects would be helpful, so we don't have to wait for a month or two just to see where things are. Like, we could maybe get helpful hints from them on where we should be heading. I think that would be really cool.
And the other thing that's been really worthwhile about it is it's helping me find ways of thinking about this that rely on the most basic features available. And I think, you know, at the moment there's some weird stuff going around abusing the validate agent callback to do agent initialization stuff. But I think in the new version, you just have a trigger that responds when the agent entry gets written the first time. So you can actually drive it off that single event. So there'll be those things that would clean it up. But in terms of the actual logic about the API and how it should look, I think it didn't need to change too much, regardless of how much the internal shift. Like, there's a pretty basic set of requirements as to what I need as a code consumer to be able to ask about a group. You know, it's like, who's in the group, and is this person in the group, and what's the group's name? There's not much else I need, really.
Yeah, good thought. Just a quick question on capability tokens. If we are moving in that direction, would that basically replace an actual, like a vouch? Like, we just have logic to issue tokens to people? Is that how it works?
Yeah, may do. I was thinking about, okay, we're going to need, like, my default was, okay, if you've got the capability, you can give it to other people, but then maybe we need like a vouch-based capability thing where you can vouch for other people to have it.
Or is the token issued also on the basis of data?
Yeah, well, that's one that I think the answer doesn't necessarily matter as to whether it's supported natively, because I don't think there's native support for, you know, assign a capability token to do something on behalf of this group, because a group is something that we're making up as an app level abstraction. But it does mean that it doesn't mean that I can't just, you know, abuse the capability system and save a capability token that's called group agent underscore group ID underscore do the thing, you know. And I think that'll be fine to set up group capabilities if we do use the actual underlying capability mechanism for it. But I have a feeling it may actually just be another abstraction where you're asking and saying, do I have this thing? I do. Okay, then
that's more what I meant.
Yeah. And I think that stuff would just be mostly calling between DNAs. It would actually be probably the foundation for how that delegated authority zone works. Is it would just ask the group agent DNA, do I have this capability? And if I do, then allow it.
Yeah.
It does. I mean, maybe you want even some overarching capability to interact with the group, because then it means you can grant that initially rather than having everything public effectively, but needing the capability token to proceed. Just part of that kind of weakened security model that I was talking about. The same thing expressed in a different way, maybe.
No, explain that. How does that lead to a weakened security model?
It's just that same thing that you need to run all the capability checks in the Zome API calls.
Oh yeah.
So, you know, in order to do that, it means that the Zome API endpoints are fully public, but you have to send the right token in the request.
Yeah.
So they require a token to access it all.
I have a question. For us less technical folks, one of our missions is to try to build a prototype and test some of these concepts from a UI perspective. What are your thoughts on taking kind of, you know, even group to group or group agent to group agent, or agent to agent? What are your thoughts on moving, you know, like the resources we talked about around biodigestion, things like that, from one agent to another? Yeah, what are your thoughts about the prototype?
Yeah, no real concerns, because it's sort of, these are the things that, because I haven't started to build the security yet, we don't have to care about the security working properly, if that makes sense. So for prototyping, you know, you can prototype all the record types and just lay out the records as if they've been countersigned, but there's no countersigning going on yet. In terms of the group stuff, the only thing that you can't do without this is having groups sort of nested as subgroups within each other. But in terms of setting up people and transferring things between individuals, and setting up groups and transferring things between groups, or, you know, from individuals within one group to another group and that kind of stuff, that's all possible with what there is, and shouldn't be an issue.
And what about doing that in a hackalong?
Yeah, it's still something I'd like to do, and actually it's been one I've been talking to Sid about a bit as well, because that kind of multi-group stuff is actually toying with the GraphQL API and being able to compose multiple collaboration spaces that I was talking about the other week. So yeah, that's what most of that work would be like, and would be quite interesting to see some of those in operation and play with how the interfaces look, because there aren't all that many value flows things out there that connect multiple collaboration spaces. It's usually, you know, been a monolithic system that the whole collective uses rather than split networks sort of thing.
Okay, I don't know if I get that. You're saying it's can you just dumb that down a little bit more for me? What isn't there?
Yeah, so the subgroups within groups isn't there. So being able to have like a I mean, I don't know, like a subcontractor that's completely contained within a parent group sort of thing. Really, it's just the part of being able to say, because I am a subcontractor, I can do things that the subcontractor can do. So yeah, but aside from that, having two different networks and having things transfer between them and connecting to them both on the same page, that's all possible.
Cool. Yeah, that's what we would love to kind of help build collaboratively with people, and using HoloREA, you know, using the some of the logic that you've been building possibly, and yeah, doing it live with people, getting them in the, you know, seeing the UI working, and I wonder how effective that would be for people seeing the code working and it being visual on UI.
Do we actually want to do it next week or in the next few weeks, whenever? Yeah, maybe next week then. Like we could maybe, Kamal, you could showcase your system and we map it onto HoloREA live.
Yeah.
That could be cool.
What do you guys
I don't know.
think?
Yeah, Posty, what do you feel about that?
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah, let's do it.
It's bold, but it would be fun. But
Yeah.
would you, Feli, would you be ready to have some pieces of UI that we could start hooking in?
With some help, yeah. I'm still confused about the GraphQL interface, so that's where I'm at. But any pointers in there would be awesome.
Yeah. Well, let's talk on Telegram, because I think, I mean, in a week we should be able to get some of that stuff wired up, and then
Yeah.
Once there's sort of like the scaffolding of an app there, we can play around with things. Hey.
Yeah, something that just from my first go trying to look at Guillem's UI, I noticed he put the GraphQL interface on, I guess, on the front end side. Is my rough understanding. Whereas HoloREA will be on the back end. So.
I know we do it on the front end as well.
Oh, okay. Okay, good to know. So I've basically just been studying the pattern that he's using there, and a lot of it's in TypeScript, so that's new for me. So yeah, just knowing what kind of things what patterns I should be focusing on, and which patterns are just specific to that. But my understanding, based on like zone design, is we wanted to. Kamal and I were talking, like, it's the observation layer, right, that sort of grabs all the flows that all end up grabbing under observation. And so I would assume that some zone in the observation DNA is going to be the UI interface, right? Specifically for invoicing or biodigester or no.
Yeah, we haven't actually thought a heap about which apps to bundle with which zones yet. Like there's a bit of that in that modules page on the wiki. But actually, like all the UI apps that I've been developing with HoloREA, I've just been developing using Create React Apps DevTools standalone without going through the holochain conductor. And when you run the holochain conductor, you just open it on a particular port, and then you can send an environment variable through to tell the React app to connect to that port. So I've been running them as kind of separate things on separate stacks at the moment, mainly because getting stuff to run through the holochain conductor is a bit annoying, and especially if you want to like do live reloading with an app and have it update as you develop. It's just other stuff to wire together.
Yeah.
Do you have an example of that UI I could just check out?
Yeah, if you have a look in the apps folder in HoloREA, it's not the best because it's a graphical interface, so it's got a few other kind of weird setup things that aren't typical to an app, but it does show some of pulling in the schema and assigning it to a UI. And if you have a look at the app.tsx file, that's kind of where most of the stuff gets set up. It's just a React component and some props really. But you'd have something similar in a real app. It would just be probably in the Redux store or a separate place to register the Apollo provider where you'd set it up. So that's one. Another one I would show you.
GitHub just changed its user interface, so I was so confused. I was like, where did all the code go? Just looking around for it. Now I see it. Okay, so you said in the apps folder.
Sorry, in
the
the app folder, not apps.
Okay.
So yeah, apps is where I've got the front end stuff, and apps is where I've got the Holoria, the DNA stuff. But yeah, there's only one in there, that GraphQL Explorer, and that's just wired up to talk to the back end. And if you check out the package.json file in the root of the repo, you'll see that when I run, which one is it? So when I run dev GraphQL Explorer, it's on line 32. Wait, I should just share my screen. Yeah, so the package.json file in the root of the repo, this is the command that actually runs it. And so it's actually deferring to its script. So let me just find out what it's doing. Yeah, this. So this is the environment variable. There's kind of a convention with React apps that they have to have this prefix for the envars to be sent through to the front end. Anyway, so I defined this, and that matches what I've got set up in the conductor config file, and that's all I need to do. Then the GraphQL schema when you pull it into the app. So this bind schema that pulls in from the GraphQL module, that's all you need in your front end app. And then if you're running Holoria in the background, it knows how to connect to it, provided you have that environment variable set up. That's all you need to do. But yeah, the other one that's worth checking out is this one. It's a fork of a project called Shroom that one of our collaborators, Ivan, built some years ago, actually. But and I'll put in the chat as well. Oh, I did, good. And that one's got a few kind of errors around some of the queries that I haven't updated yet. So when you spin that up with Holoria, you'll find that you actually just get a broken page, but it does work enough that everything is actually talking to the REA backend through the schema. So it's just another example of what it looks like in a more normal app. And yeah, let me see. Just trying to find some worthwhile files for that one. But you can see with that one, it runs React scripts to do the build. And I recommend that. It's kind of the easiest way to get started with a React app if you just use the create React app scaffolding. Let me find it. Yeah, this one. And there might even be some, like there may well be an Apollo boilerplate somewhere that starts with Apollo integrated into it. But yeah, maybe I would probably just put it in myself. It's pretty easy to integrate. The Apollo docs are really good. But that's all you really need, a React app with Apollo. And then once you've got that, it'll be pretty straightforward how you plug in the VF GraphQL holochain schema into Apollo. And once you've done that, then you can just start writing GraphQL queries and finding UI to them.
Okay, sorry, just one more time. Where was the binder, the binding link that needs to be included in the front end? Just where that, what file was that in?
Oh, that's in the actual module itself. I'll send it through the chat.
This is my second time using React, so wish me luck. It was mostly my friend who was doing it too. So I was doing that.
Should we close out this call though, and you guys can continue? the discussion?
Yeah.
Yep. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
I might even publish a new version of this module too. Anyway.
All right.
Cool. Well, this has been really interesting. Thank you for
Yeah.
the pointers.
Yeah. And thanks,
Yeah.
Posby, for taking us through group agents.
No worries. I hope it was useful.
Yep.
All right,
Awesome.
thank you.
What's the
Thank you.
best way for people to like offer feedback and keep pushing the conversation? Forums?
Yeah, forums or the GitHub thread, either or. Probably forums is more central, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.